Hi everyone, this is Sam here, a current college student at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Welcome to my podcast, College Conscience, where we talk about the good, the bad, and everything in between with the college experience. With each episode, I focus on a different topic pertaining to college life with a different friend, and I really want to hear their perspectives and see what advice they have for me and anyone who might listen about that specific topic. Some examples include health and wellness, academics, professional career, exploration, and even more. So, if you're interested in any of those topics, please stick around and hear what my friends have to say. Hey, Maggie, thanks so much for being on the podcast today. I really appreciate it. Could you just introduce yourself to the audience as well as the topic we'll be talking about today?
Yeah, for sure. So my name is Maggie. I am a senior at Georgetown University. In my free time, I like to cook, I like to run, I like to hang out with Sam Lee. And the topic that we're going to be talking about today is the value of book clubs or reading just as a shared activity rather than as something that you do individually.
Yeah, perfect. Let's get into it. So, growing up, could you talk a bit about how you discovered books and then as well as finding those communities where people could read together?
Yeah, so something that's quite interesting is that I think growing up, actually reading for me wasn't so much of a collaborative activity. It's so interesting because I think the structures that we have uh, that encourage us to read are sort of competitively based in a weird way. I don't know if you remember doing those, read 100 books and then get like a free Six Flags ticket, or like whoever reads the most in this is something they did in my first grade class. Whoever reads the most gets like some sort of special prize at the end of the year, right? So reading for me was something where I saw it almost not necessarily competitive, but definitely as something that you do individually, and that is something that can be quantified rather than obviously, like as many people would say, has its other values other than the number of books that you read. Um, I think for me personally, it was reading has always been something that's a little bit easier to enjoy. When I was really little, I remember something that was and probably maybe a reason why I really enjoy this is because of how much credit I got from my parents for it. But when I was really young, like about 6 months old, I went to China and actually lived with my grandparents for 3 years. And during that time, what something they taught me, and apparently something that's quite common, is that they have you learn a lot of poetry, and not just poetry, but sometimes even reading poetry, which is when you're very really quite young. And I doubt how much I actually understood what it meant, but to read it, to recite it, um, was something that I learned right away. And then when I came to the U.S., my parents were afraid for a little while that I was going to be ESL, or that they were worried that there was going to be difficulties with transitioning to a different language, to learning English, because that's the language that my preschool was taught in. And they um they were really, really surprised and glad and encouraging when I started expressing interest in books. And I think it was like by the time I was like in kindergarten, my I was like reading um those like pamphlets that they give out on like the first day of kindergarten, where it's information for the parents, right? But I would like be like reading it to my mom, and apparently all the other parents were very excited and oh my god, impressed by that. So I think in every stage I was really quite encouraged to enjoy reading. And for me, it's always been an exercise in sort of like this thing that Ursula K. Le Guin says, where you can really explore a lot of different worlds, not just literally in like fantasy, but every book in some way is not going to be. And I prefer fiction over nonfiction. I think it's more interesting. I think it's more entertaining to see what someone's mind does with this story. So for me, because of those two elements is people who really encouraged me throughout life, and also personally thinking that it's one of the most creative endeavors. It's a demonstration of like, sort of how far the limits of your imagination can be stretched, and also obviously sometimes in ways that can change your mindset to the way that you apply it to real world issues.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think that was truly an amazing story. I've not heard, I think, the first half of it. I don't think we've ever really talked about it, but super cool that you were like a genius in kindergarten. I mean, you're a genius now, so I guess this the continuation of the genius storyline for sure, for sure. I think
Stop. Well, I feel like actually it's not well, thank you, but I think that a lot of people have that story when they're younger. I don't know if
interesting.
it's
This is the
me.
first time I've heard of that.
No, like, not necessarily the exact same story, but, like, a story
Okay.
of, like, when I was younger, which is related. I swear it's related to this podcast. Um, which is just related because in the sense that I think a lot of people start out, if you ask a lot of people when they're younger, "Did you like to read?" Especially at this university or especially at whatever you'd call it, like elite universities, you're gonna get from a lot of people that, "Yeah, I was a total bookworm." And maybe that indicated something in terms of where I was going in the future. But the question I think is, like, how much that's really persisted over time.
Yeah, for sure. That's also a point that I wanted to ask you. Like growing up, did you feel like your enjoyment of reading, how do you feel like it changed as you like got to middle school or high school? Or do you feel like it was more constant? Like how was it happening as you grew up?
Yeah, I think that's one of those things is like when you're younger, obviously in elementary school, they're still giving you the Six Flags ticket vouchers, but the idea that you have to be rewarded in some way to read, I'm sure a lot of people ended up reading more books and maybe developing more love of reading because of that. But I think once you take away those incentives, because they don't offer those in like middle school or high school anymore, um, a lot of people really and I think a lot of people really don't like to read or don't think, it's a valuable spend of their time. There's some barriers of people if you're reading a book that you, has vocabulary or has content that you don't feel like is accessible, it can be really difficult to read, and get into it, and I think getting past that barrier of, like, the first 50, first 100 pages, having that level of patience at some level, although I don't think I'm necessarily a super patient person, I think to be willing to kind of, like, stick with a book and say, "There's probably some value to this," because that's, like, a very difficult portion for a lot of people, and I think, the third thing is that, liking to read I think a lot of our hobbies nowadays have become and they should be, collaborative in some sense that, even if you're playing like, for example, watching TV shows, right? TV shows are cool, but you also want to watch them the same ones that other people are watching, so you can talk about what's happening in those, shows um, and even, like, playing video games or anything. A lot of people play collaboratively with other people. So given those aspects, if someone's like, if you're sort of the only person who's reading, I think it becomes like a self-creating cycle where a lot of people don't read. It's all to say people don't read that often in middle school and high school, but I feel like I really did. I don't know how. Let me think about like how that happened. I think it's more so that I had sort of developed this identity already in elementary school that I was even more so than other people was the person who loved to read, right? And I would always be toting a book around. I'd be like walking into walls, all those sorts of things. And I really think that it became one of those things, like many other things that I carried on from probably as early as like elementary school, that became part of my identity, and I felt like at some levels I couldn't move away from it. You know what I mean? Um, other examples of this, like math theme, like Science Olympiad, like you know what I mean? Yeah, I think to me it was a level of if I don't have this, sort of what distinguishes me from other people, what is like sort of the essence of what I do, and I I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing because I still enjoy reading, and I think at some level it's not that it's not true, but I do think that there was that sort of like social expectation, social norm that to me really helped contribute to me really liking to read. And I think um, also I don't know how to explain that like just it's when you enjoy something, just like you with tennis or something.
Me with podcasting.
You with podcasting. It's just when something really when after you're done sort of doing it, and I don't know how to quantify it in a way where it's like during the process of reading, during the process of playing tennis, right? You're sort of in that flow or whatever they call it, where you really feel like you've hit a certain level of skill, um, or a certain level of like experience. I've done this multiple times before. but also there's that secondary factor of there's more that I could learn here. There's more that I can apply this. And you can't be on one end or the other end of that spectrum, right? Because that's not interesting. Um, but to be like sort of in the middle somewhere, I think there's always it makes you feel sort of throughout that you want to keep on doing it. So I think that's my experience with reading.
Yeah, for sure. No, I think that's awesome. Let's jump to college now. And as you said, you're a Georgetown senior, but this is your third year at Georgetown. So can you talk a bit about when you came into Georgetown as a freshman, how you felt like reading was becoming part of your college life and how that might have changed from freshman to sophomore year?
Yeah, I definitely so the interesting thing is switching around from in middle school and high school when I felt like this was the thing that distinguished me from other people that I like to read. Um that more so in college I realized that something that you feel, and maybe this is the whole competitive atmosphere that you get in high school and in college, you feel like obviously it's still competitive. I mean, everyone would say Georgetown at some levels feels like you're trying to prove something to other people at all times, but I think at least your freshman year, you feel that you have just completed a long cycle of competing against other people to be recognized as something that deserves admission, or, um, that you have at least like accomplished something. And you're starting to look for those spaces where you're going to work together with other people and find and just appreciate the other people around you. And I think something that was really helpful my freshman year was to be part of this. Actually, this is like sort of this central impetus of this whole like discussion that we're having, which is that for the first time I joined a book club, and I actually had never been part of a book club before. I'd always thought about it, and I was like, this is a very natural thing for me to be part of a book club. But I think I'd never, I the types of books that I read were not really books that other people would read, and that sounds so like
You're different. You're
I'm
that
so
girl.
different. I'm
You are that
so
girl.
quirky. No, I literally well, I think everyone who I knew, maybe just the friends I made, were like reading definitely a lot, but they would read like YA books and stuff, right? And there's nothing wrong with YA books. It was just that like some level they like didn't really interest me. And I was really into, like I said, like Ursula K. Le Guin, a lot of science fiction, a lot of fiction just in general. Whatever was I have Goodreads, and I think everyone should have Goodreads, but whatever was really popular on Goodreads at the time, I was trying to just read those things that, like, a lot of people read, but I realized the demographic of Goodreads is not necessarily high school, like, girls who I was friends with, right? So I didn't really know who was reading these similar things, and a lot of the stuff that I was interested in as well was some like philosophy and stuff. I went made my way through like Thoreau, and I was interested. Oh God, thank God I never actually did read it, but like I was like, oh, I should read Kant or something. Um, and what else was it that people um, were like reading? Actually, the idea that I wasn't part of a book club is kind of a lie, because now I'm just turning it all around because I would say more so, my senior year of high school, actually, and I'm just remembering this, it was always, like, in the English classes, right? And the English class I had my senior year of high school was, like, a really incredible experience because, everyone in that class, like, did the reading, which is an incredibly rare thing to have. Um, and I never really thought of a book club before. That's probably the best example of book club. We read like Plato, um, Nietzsche, Freud, Kundera, Unbearable Lightness of Being, great book, Virginia Woolf. I think all those things like really should demonstrate to me that. But when I got to college, I was not about to take an English class because I didn't think I was going to become an English major. But I was still sort of like anticipating and looking for that space. I think where I really found it was in this club called Readicals, which existed my freshman year and no longer exists. And it was led by three women who I still have like very deep respect for, like all three of them, because the reason why it was called Readicals is because it was a book or it was a book club that was focused on reading literature that was like politically radical and oftentimes challenged a lot of the sort of colonial legacies or curriculum that is very like pro state, pro yeah, I would honestly say like pro imperialist that exists at Georgetown. Um, because a lot of our fiction, especially at Georgetown, where it's located in Washington, D.C., and a lot of the classes are taught by professors who have a vested interest in the continuation of the U.S. government as is, or the expansion of the U.S. government. I don't think people are necessarily terrible people, but I think there is a lot of tendency to um, encourage status quo international relations. And so what this club intended to do was to fight against that. And they had us read like really interesting readings. We read Angela Davis's oh my god, why am I forgetting the name of the book? But we read Angela Davis's work on why prisons should be abolished. Um, we read Audre Lorde and Frantz Fanon, Wretched of the Earth, which was about how post-colonial, like a book that was addressed to not necessarily to white people or to people who were part of Western countries that are often considered like the arbiters of like this Westphalian system, but people from countries that would traditionally be considered part of the global South. So to have that space where we read this literature that is not really encouraged in classes was really deeply moving because, and especially as a freshman, where sometimes it felt almost like dangerous to be reading this stuff because when you would bring it up in class, your professor wouldn't necessarily like it, or your professor might not have even read it before. And as a freshman, feeling like you had access to that, you need other people. And these girls who were like sophomores, juniors, were really helpful in terms of making me feel like other people had read it before. That wasn't going through this process of like challenging Georgetown's system of education by myself.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think those are definitely very valid points and such a unique experience. I think also to have that your freshman year. You mentioned that this club no longer exists. So I'm curious if you could talk a bit about how that affected you once you didn't have that space anymore.
Yeah, it's really it was interesting because my freshman year even, there was sort of we were doing it online, so I think that that was its own structure. But the difficulty with those spaces is that oftentimes the people who want to run those spaces, or like have the capacity or like have the capability of taking that sort of standpoint, and know about these sort of different literatures to read, are people who are doing really important work in other ways. Oftentimes they might also have like be more likely to be in positions where they have to either like support their family or like be more present, all sorts of burdens that even just generally come with being a POC or queer at a PWI. And so I think from the beginning, like many other clubs, I think it was challenged. um, but I think what really the issue became more so uh, whether or not what was happening in this club, the act of reading, was being helpful at all, in the sense that are we sort of just going around in circles and intellectually um, like like buffering ourselves, you know what I mean? Or are we in some way by reading this becoming radical in a way that we could apply to the world. And that's always the issue with um, book clubs that has happened in the past, right? Is that they seem like so suburban, so privileged in some way. Who has time for for a book club but somebody who maybe is a university student, which is, itself is its own privilege, or someone who is like the idea of reading books as like a luxury and something that doesn't necessarily make visible changes in the world. That was a really difficult thing that I think the founders and also everyone else in the club struggled with understanding. Um, yeah. I think, like, that was probably the reason why the club fell apart at the end because it, um people felt like there were better things that we could do with our time.
Yeah.
But, yeah, it still makes me, like, kind of, sad because I feel like it was one of those spaces that, um, frankly, like, also connected me to resources that I didn't know existed. Um I think the other people in that club feeling and sometimes it can be as easy as, like, other people who have access to, like or are doing community work, and you might not meet those people through other avenues, at Georgetown, but through that club, I feel like it was I met so many people who were community organizers and understood a lot more of the work that students and also people in DC in general can do to help, um, DC communities.
Right, right. So now moving to present day, this episode is actually coming on Thanksgiving. So on this Thanksgiving day, how do you feel like you've been reclaiming that structure, or how do you feel like you are as a reader now and what community you have for it now? Just give us an update of how you feel now about it.
Yeah, I think it was how do I feel now about it? It's very, interesting that it's coming on Thanksgiving Day. Um, sure, with a beyond the implications of Thanksgiving just as a holiday, but, um, like, the theory of, like, being grateful just in general, right? Or, like, expressing gratitude. Um, I think I'm, intensely grateful to have that experience, even as something that has, like, passed and is no longer existing. I think like many books, it sort of follows the same model where I think I've seen and, am aware or have played out in my mind this model that existed that I didn't know before that could exist. And, like, what have I done since, is a great question because I think, there hasn't really been a replacement. I know part of the reason I wanted to talk about this when I was like, "Oh, it's like Sam's podcast," is because, we together, like, last year, talked about, reading together and taking time out of our weeks to read. But that's, like, really difficult because, usually one of every single week, either you, me, or the other person who was part of this, book club that we had, like, informal book club that we created, had something going on. Um there were, like, weeks where one of us was like, "Oh, we have to read, but we'll do, like, a reading, from, like, a class," which I don't think is, like, the same thing in my opinion. But I think, like, we're all, like, super busy people. And so, and I don't think that there's ever like, I mean, I think there could be more people interested in taking time out of their day to read, for example, like, France and on. But I think that amount of people as well is so delimited, and usually they're people who maybe know each other. Um, and if not, like, how do you sort of, generate interest, in that thing? If there's a structure, I think that the hardest thing that has existed so far is the fact that there hasn't been a structure and it has failed. So, I almost for me personally, I'm like, I would love to go back to that old structure, but because it's already failed in existence, right? That the idea of, like, creating the same thing with the same people is already, um you have to think of something creative to some creative reason why it would work better this time. Um, and in some sense, as someone who's, at the end of their time at Georgetown, um please, the way that you're looking at me right now. Anyways.
For context, I jokingly bring up Maggie's impending graduation in sometimes false terms in terms of time, but continuing.
Not false terms. This man always asks me, he says, "How does it feel to be leaving Georgetown next week?" Anyways,
Okay, you're
but
counting down the days.
no, literally counting down the days. But, um, it's it's difficult to see how you would create a structure that's sustainable as well. Because that's one thing that we think about is, like, with, like, community structures, and something that I think Sam and I have talked about before, which is how do you create sustainable structures when you are the first one to imagine how something exists, right? How do you create something that is like long lasting and something that um, perseveres? Um, I mean, in a very meta way, I think we learned this from books, which is that, you know, all books in some level, and especially ones that are really famous, like Harry Potter or something, they only have one chance to convince the reader. And they also develop off a model where oftentimes they're the first of their genre or the first of their kind. And um, they have the burden of proving exactly why you should believe in these things. Why is it that you should even care about what these characters are doing or how this world works? What's the kind of intrinsic value that you're going to get out of it? And to be able to do that successfully, I think is one of the hardest things. And I don't know, again with limited time, how capable I am of ensuring that someone else would have a structure that's sustainable enough.
Oh, I think that's something definitely to let people ponder on, and also maybe we can reconvene next semester and see the update. But I kind of like that ambiguity. I mean, we talked a lot about this last year in a class we shared, but I think that's true sometimes where like at the end of an episode, like even the end of your Georgetown chapter, like you don't have all the answers and it's not like all tied up. And I think the fact that you're still asking those questions is very real in a sense that I think people tend to dismiss. So I think it's fine that like you have those questions. Not that I don't think you think it's fine, but just in terms of like for the podcast, I think it's fine to end it at that because you know you're still thinking about it. I'm definitely still thinking about it. Um, but yeah, I like that.
Yeah. If anyone here is interested, anyone who's listening to this is
Literally,
interested in reading with me, please reach out to me. Should
yes.
I bleep out mine? I'm like,
We'll
let me
include
just get my
contact.
phone number.
We'll include context for
Uh,
sure.
okay.
Well, thanks so much, Maggie, for being on the podcast. I really do appreciate your time again and a very insightful episode. But yes, just thanks so much again.
Yeah, thanks, Sam.
Hi, everyone. This is Sam here, a current college student at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Welcome to my podcast, College Conscience, where we talk about the good, the bad, and everything in between with the college experience. With each episode, I focus on a different topic pertaining to college life with a different friend, and I really want to hear their perspectives and see what advice they have for me and anyone who might listen about that specific topic. Some examples include health and wellness, academics, professional career, exploration, and even more. So if you're interested in any of those topics, please stick around and hear what my friends have to say.